This is the first lecture on emerging adulthood. Please bear with me as I'm going to be doing some experimenting with the technology. But for now, we're going to go ahead and try it this way. So Arnett talks about a couple of typical markers for adulthood. And some of the most common are things like leaving home, entering full-time work, finishing education, marriage, and parenthood. However, surveys of college students have actually shown that these students really focus more on intangible markers of ending adulthood. So things like taking responsibility for your actions, making independent decisions, and financial independence. And so it's important to remember that those who are going through emerging adulthood are actually have different markers than maybe people who have passed that stage are thinking of. So this is such a long period. Typically, the phase of emerging adulthood is considered from 18 to 25. Some people put the marker closer to 30. But it's such a long period that it really is more than just a transition to adulthood. 7 to 12 years is a long time to be transitioning. Plus, there are a lot of things that are changing during this time. So relationship with parents, some emerging adults are living at home, but this is very different than their experiences during high school. Romantic relationships are changing, so in terms of relationships with, or in terms of the establishment of marriage and parenthood, changing values in dating, all of these are changing across the context of emerging adulthood. Education is also really important for emerging adults. So making decisions about whether to go to college, considering alternatives, things like that are big issues that emerging adults are facing. Work is also a big issue in emerging adulthood, so deciding on what career and how to get into that career. This has been particularly affected for emerging adults during the recession, but all emerging adults are making these work decisions. Finances are also a big issue, so this idea of education comes with a lot of potential debt. So the question is college debt worth it? When do you decide to take out loans for houses or cars? Finally, there are differences in emerging adulthood with religion and community and values. Often emerging adults are seen as kind of not having a lot of ties to the community, but it could just be that they have them in different ways. Throughout this class, we'll focus on this from a psychology perspective, but we'll also consider sociology, economics, and how those things affect emerging adulthood, because you'll find that they often overlap. So there's a lot of kind of changes in emerging adulthood that we'll discuss. A third of people in their 20s move to a new home every year. 40% move back in with their parents at least once. There's an average of 7 jobs. People have an average of 7 jobs in their 20s. So you see there's a lot of kind of transitions. And there's a lot of differences chronologically as well. So by age 30, in the 1960s, 77% of women and 60% of men considered themselves having reached adulthood. In the 2000s, only 50% of women and 33% of men consider themselves to have reached adulthood. And this is measured by the typical milestones like finishing school, leaving home, and financial independence. So what we see is that the typical 30-year-old in 2000 has completed as many milestones as the typical 25-year-old in 1970. So we're seeing this kind of extending much later than it has in previous generations. So there's this argument that maybe there's a new stage of adulthood. So historically, people were much more likely to make the transition directly from adolescence to adulthood. In the 60s and 70s, most people were married and had finished their education by age 21. And consistent with that, most people had their first child within 1 year of marriage. However, one big difference we see is that people are getting married later now. So the average first year of marriage, or average age of first marriage, is 6 years later now than it was in the 1960s. So we're seeing these chronological changes with different generations. And parents also agree that adulthood is beginning later. So this is the percent of parents saying their children have been financially independent by age 22 or younger or 25 or older. And what you can see is that in 1993, there's 80% of parents are saying their kids should be financially independent by age 22, whereas in 2011, only 67% are saying that. So parents see their kids as less financially independent. However, there are some counter-arguments. So Arnett, your textbook author, argues that emerging adulthood is just like any other developmental stage. However, there's a few things that make it different than things like toddlerhood or early childhood. So first, emerging adulthood is not universal. So it doesn't happen for everyone, either within the US, it doesn't happen for all emerging adults. It also doesn't happen in other countries necessarily in the same way. So according to stage theories, if we think back to your child development classes, things like Piaget, a stage is something that everyone has to go through, and without it, they won't develop successfully. There's lots and lots of people who develop just fine without really going through this emerging adulthood stage. So it's not essential compared to other stages. So we're kind of seeing this as something that's heterogeneous and non-essential. Essentially, that means that it's varying from person to person. So this is kind of the argument against what Arnett is saying, that it's not a life stage. The video, the TED Talk that you have posted on Moodle by Meg J is another great example of kind of a counter-argument to what's happening in emerging adulthood. So Arnett goes over this pretty extensively in the first chapter, so I'm not going to cover this too much, but you should be really familiar with the basic characteristics of emerging adulthood. Identity exploration, instability, self-focus, feelings of in-between or being in transition, and sense of possibility and hope. In terms of identity exploration, though, I did want to go a little more into this. If you've taken child or adolescent development, this should be a review, but just in case. So James Marcia is the person who kind of coined this idea of identity exploration and identity formation. And he argues that this process happens for all of our different identities: occupational, religious, political views, things like that. And for each of our identities, we go through a crisis or a phase of exploration. So a crisis is when we've kind of thought about our issues and explored alternatives. And then we also make a commitment. So when we've made a commitment, we've basically resolved the questions that have been made and chosen a stance. So based on whether somebody has reached a crisis or a commitment, we can have 4 different stages of identity exploration. So identity diffusion is when somebody hasn't made a commitment and hasn't experienced a crisis. So this stage is kind of arguing that, or realizing that adults don't know everything, but they're not really grappling with the issue. So if we take the example of religion, we might think somebody in identity diffusion might say something like, well, I haven't really thought about religion, I don't really know what I believe. In foreclosure, people have made a commitment but haven't experienced a crisis. So they've selected an identity prematurely without a lot of thought or exploring the options. So somebody in foreclosure might say something like, well, I'm Catholic because my parents are Catholic and that's how I grew up. In moratorium, people are kind of in crisis mode, they're questioning, they're looking for answers, but they haven't made a commitment. So somebody in moratorium might say something like, I'm evaluating my religion, I'm skeptical about what I've been taught, and I'm looking into other faiths, but they haven't made a commitment. And then finally, identity achievement is when they've resolved their crisis and commitments based on experience. So somebody in identity achievement might say something like, I've done a lot of soul searching about my religion and other religions, and I know what I believe. And generally, the path is people start out in diffusion or foreclosure, they go to moratorium and experience crisis, look into other options, and then develop achieve identity in the late teens or early 20s. However, this is not necessarily a fixed sequence, so not everyone goes through the same stages. Most of the research on this is in adolescence, but what you can see is that this is age 18. Rarely have people achieved identity, so this dotted blue line is the identity achievement line. Only about 25% of people have achieved identity by age 18. Identity achievement continues to increase through age 24 and possibly even beyond. So even at age 24, only 60% of people have achieved identity. Okay, so these are some common kind of misconceptions about emerging adults. Things like emerging adults have very little work ethic. One of the main arguments against this is the fact that there's a very different job market now than there were 30 years ago. So a lot of emerging adults are kind of settling to do non-career oriented things. Another common belief is that emerging adults have lots of debt. Actually, many of emerging adults are kind of afraid of debt or have college debt that will pay off in the long run, which we'll talk about later. Another common belief is that emerging adults are afraid of commitment. Although just as many are getting married, they're just getting married later. Another is that they don't care about politics. We'll find that they're involved in different ways. One question is, have emerging adults gotten better off? Are they better off than they were 50 years ago? What we find is that today's emerging adults have better high school GPAs, they rate themselves as more likable, they have more social and academic confidence and come into college with more AP credits, but they take longer to complete college and they score lower on standardized tests. So we have to really think about whether these improved perceptions are actually a good thing. Is it overconfidence, or is it actually evidence of improvement? Okay, in terms of why we should study emerging adults, we've already established that adolescence is an important period. We know that there are changes in education, healthcare, social services, things like that. But these changes could be very different in emerging adulthood. So one of the reasons that we need to study this is to figure out how to accommodate emerging adults' needs in terms of education, healthcare, and social services. This is just an activity for you to pause and do on your own. What I'd like you to do is list the most important life events that have occurred to you and the age at which they occurred, and also do the major life events that you expect in the future and estimate when you think they will happen. So pause this and do that now. And then I'd like you to calculate how many events occurred in each age range. So how many of your events occurred 10 or younger, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, and so on. If you plot this, most likely what you will see is that essentially emerging adulthood is the most memorable stage, in that you see this evidence that people remember more in their 20s than any other period in their life. What we find is that the brain transcribes novel and unique experiences more than mundane ones, and the 20s is a period of a lot of varied and exciting things. Things like getting married and having children, things like that. We also find that if you ask kids about future events, their future events that they expect to remember are clustered in emerging adulthood. So it's not just about memory. So we are culturally conditioned. We have this culturally conditioned storyline that helps us make up kind of our life story. And so we have these life scripts that are benchmark life events like childbirth and weddings. And what we find is our happy memories are rehearsed more and remembered more, and that can lead to the memory bump. So a lot of these happen in emerging adulthood, and so we have this memory bump. Another reason is that identity formation happens in the 20s, and so that our self-perceptions are forming them. Finally, this is just a quick note on what's being discussed in the twins chapter, and this is this idea of locus of control. And so I just wanted to briefly discuss an internal locus of control is the belief that you control your own destiny, whereas an external locus of control is the belief that chance or fate or luck determines what happens to you. And generally, internal locus of control is associated with better schoolwork, more productivity, positive things, whereas external locus of control is associated with poor grades on tests and academics and things like that. And so you'll read more about this if you haven't already in the twins chapter.